Chapter 7, Tax Credits. In 7.7, we determine use and calculation of the adoption credit. Taxpayers are provided 2 tax breaks for adoption expenses. A tax credit is allowed for qualified adoption expenses paid by taxpayers, and an exclusion from W-2 income is allowed for qualified adoption expenses paid by taxpayers' employers. The adoption credit is a non-refundable income tax credit for qualified adoption expenses. Form 8839 is used to calculate and report the adoption credit. The total expense that can be taken as a credit for all tax years with respect to an adoption of a child is $13,810. This credit is the total amount for each adoption and not an annual amount. The credit is not refundable. However, the unused portion may be carried forward for 5 years. In the case of an adoption of an eligible child who is a U.S. citizen, the credit for qualified adoption expenses is allowed for the tax year that follows the year during which the expenses are paid or incurred, unless the expenses are paid or incurred in the year in which the adoption becomes final. If the expenses are paid during the year in which the adoption becomes final, the credit is allowed for that year. The full $13,810 is allowed in special needs adoptions, regardless of the amount of the qualified adoption expenses paid. Qualified adoption expenses include court costs, legal fees, travel, etc. In the case of an adoption of a child who is not a U.S. citizen, then the credit for qualified adoption expenses is not available unless the adoption becomes final. Qualified adoption expenses paid or incurred before the tax year in which the adoption becomes final are taken into account for the credit as if the expenses were paid or incurred in the tax year in which the adoption is finalized. An employee may exclude from income on W-2 amounts paid or expenses incurred by his or her employer for qualified adoption expenses connected with the adoption of a child by the employee, if the amounts are furnished under an adoption assistance program. An individual may claim both a credit and an exclusion in connection with the adoption of an eligible child, but you may not claim both a credit and an exclusion for the same expense.